I've had people ask about my family's paranormal experiences with a cult, so here it is. Very soon after getting involved with them, we started having paranormal activity in our home. And when we moved to the same town as the leaders, the activity increased. During our time in the cult, the leaders decided I should move in with them and 4 other teenage girls. One evening, my friend and I were doing homework at the kitchen table when my back suddenly started stinging and burning. It was irritating, so I asked my friend to have a look. Rolled up my shirt. She stared at my back in confusion. There were 3 long scratches down the center of my back. It almost looked like a cat had its way with me, but they were way too big and far apart to be from a cat. Plus, we didn't have a cat. My friend seemed pretty freaked out by it, so I went to look in the bathroom mirror. There's no way I could have done this to myself. I wasn't worried. I assumed it had happened earlier, and I was only just now noticing. But then it happened again, a couple of months later, while I was playing on the computer. Out of nowhere, I felt that same stinging, burning sensation, again on my back. I went to the bathroom, lifted my shirt, and found 3 scratch marks, very similar to the first set. They were just a little shorter and off-center. This time, I was a little worried, but I figured it must be from the clothing I was wearing. Eventually, I pushed it from my mind until years later, when I heard about it happening to many others. And it happened to me again, just before I moved out of the cult house. It was late morning. My sister and I were chatting in her room, which was in the basement. Next to her room is the utility room and the staircase. Her door was closed, and we were about to go upstairs when we suddenly heard a growl. It was coming from the utility room. It wasn't like a cat or a dog. It was the deep, low sound of something like a lion or a bear. It's so hard to describe. When I first heard it, I was confused and frightened. My mind was racing, wondering how a wild animal could be in the house. Then, I thought someone must have an aggressive dog outside, even though it sounded nothing like a dog. I was just trying to make sense of it. Some sort of primal instinct kicked in. I became filled with dread as the growling got louder. It sounded like it was getting closer to the door. Panicked, I looked at my sister, and I see she's completely frozen. Her face was filled with fear and confusion, and I was seriously considering an escape out the window. She said to sit still and be quiet, but I couldn't. The growls were getting louder and closer. I couldn't sit there doing nothing, so I started screaming for my mom. The growling stopped immediately. I screamed for a solid minute before stopping to listen, and it was totally silent. My heart was pounding, but I told my sister we had to run for it. She tried to stop me, but I opened the door and didn't see anything. We raced upstairs and told our mother everything. There was an incident when I spent the night in my sister's room. We had just gotten into bed, and as soon as the room was totally silent, there was a loud whisper from the end of the bed. It said my name as clear as day, and nothing else. I couldn't tell if it sounded male or female. I grabbed my sister, totally freaked out, and she had heard it too. I clung to her, terrified, trying to process what we had heard. She said not to give it any attention, but I was too frightened to stay there. I got a glass of water to calm down and slept on the couch that night. I am a professional paranormal researcher with over 40 years' experience. I hold many degrees and certificates that aid in my research. Some are strictly paranormal, while others are more general. This is a true story about when I was being oppressed by a demon, how it felt, and what I did to resolve it. I am a non-denominational Christian, paranormal believer, pastoral counselor, and minister. These are my beliefs, and only included to provide a basis for the ideas that I express here. I started having trouble with sleeping, emotional outbursts, severe mood swings, feeling of impending doom. This went on for 2 weeks before I took action. I believed it was related to my many health issues. My doctor ordered blood work, various tests. They all came back normal. Within 6 weeks, I'd exhausted all of my personal resources to address this issue. I didn't immediately assume it was paranormal, but I attempted to intervene with my spiritual beliefs and practices. This did provide some relief, but it only lasted a couple of hours to a few days. Eventually, I sought the help of another minister. He wanted to perform a minor exorcism to see what effect it might have. I'm very lucky to have another professional available, especially one that I have a personal relationship with. His familiarity with me validated his concerns and gave him the confidence to proceed much faster than the process normally allows. During the exorcism, the demon identified itself by name. It stated that God gave it the authority to afflict me, and that I have invited it by punishing myself. I have no memory of this, but it spoke using my voice. It was cast out in the name of Jesus, and we followed his protocol for these types of situations. Once it was over, I felt immediate relief. My friend questioned me extensively on how I may have been punishing myself. It was very hard to admit, especially with my position as a pastoral counselor, that I had a lot of guilt for things that happened in my life. Some were things that I had done, while others were things done to me. For several weeks, he counseled me to help me deal with these issues, so this wouldn't happen again. As a result of this whole experience, I have questions. This was a demon, and though it was oppressing me, it seemed that it was for my own good. I've seen this happen when helping other people, but is this the norm? Is this the mind part of the spirit? I've seen entities carry mental afflictions that they had in life. Should there be more of an investigation from a parapsychological point of view in all of these cases? I appreciate any input and thoughts. I'm a 26-year-old female who's fascinated by the paranormal, but I didn't always believe in it. I was open to the idea, but didn't put much stock into it. Over the years, that's drastically changed. When my wife and I were newlyweds, we were best friends with another couple. We would travel together, go on double dates. One day, they went out of town, and we agreed to watch their animals. They had a cat, a bearded dragon, a red iguana, and 2 rats. Since I worked near their home, I'd go over in the morning, during my lunch hour, and again in the evening. I was usually alone for the morning and afternoon visits, and my wife would join me for the evening visit. One day during the afternoon visit, I purposely left the lights off because there was enough natural light to see fairly well without them, and I wanted to save a little on their electric bill. I did not touch the lights. After checking on the animals, I returned to work. When my wife and I came back that evening, the outside entryway and hallway lights were both on. I told my wife I was 100% sure I hadn't done it. She thought that someone from their HOA or a relative had stopped by. Or someone had noticed they were out of town and broke in. We each put a car key between our knuckles and entered the house. It was eerily quiet. I couldn't hear any of the animals, and the air felt stale. I could have choked on it. We slowly made our way through the house, looking for any sign of disturbance, and every single light was on. But nothing was out of place. We both relaxed somewhat. I began gaslighting myself into believing that I had somehow turned on all of the lights. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the reptile room, the one that we had just left, and it was so loud that the house shook. We threw open the door, but nothing had moved, not even an inch. The only thing that had changed was the bearded dragon. Its large enclosure was on the floor and had a sliding glass door in front of it. The dragon, who had been peacefully resting just a minute before, was now rhythmically tapping his nose against the glass, over and over again. It was almost robotic. I stared in disbelief. I'd never seen an animal behave like that. I walked to the enclosure, gently sliding the glass door open, and the dragon continued to tap on the glass that wasn't there, before its beard suddenly went pitch black. Then it scrambled out of the enclosure and straight for the exit. Luckily, my wife was able to close the door in time, but once he reached it, he started tapping on it in the same pattern that he had been doing on the glass. Suddenly, on the other side of the door, we heard another, even louder thud, followed immediately by the cat screaming. It was horrible, but I didn't have time to react before we heard clanging and clattering in the other enclosures behind us. The iguana was wildly whipping its tail against the sides and hissing. It was terrifying. I quickly returned the dragon to its enclosure, and he immediately resumed tapping. My wife grabbed the doorknob. I'll never forget the fear and disbelief in her voice when she said that it wouldn't open. I rushed over and started yanking as hard as I could, but the knob wouldn't even turn. It wasn't broken. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I banged on it, screaming as true panic set in. My head was fuzzy, my chest was tight, and I thought I would pass out. Then, it suddenly all stopped. The cat fell silent. The iguana stopped whipping. The dragon stopped tapping. And the door opened easily. When we left that room, the rest of the lights were now off. My wife and I bolted outside and remained silent the whole way home. The next day, I'd almost convinced myself that it was a fluke, that the animals had upset each other. When I told my friend about the weird experience, she replied,
"Oh, I forgot to mention, we've had a lot of activity lately."
"What do you mean by activity?" I asked. She then explained that the former owner, an elderly man, had passed away in the home after owning it for 40 years. Ever since they started the renovations, she'd been seeing a male figure in the corners or at the bottom of the stairs. He would rile up the animals and mess with the lights, but he'd never been violent. Only mischievous, as he was upset about the renovations. After that, I reevaluated my outlook on the paranormal, and now I sure as hell believe. In the 3rd grade, I had an experience where I lost a chunk of time. 4 months later, things were mostly back to normal, except I started having trouble sleeping. Sometimes I would just lay there, wide awake for up to 6 hours, and it eventually wore me down. my parents took me to a doctor who said the issue was probably related to scary movies and late-night TV, which was obviously not the case. I wasn't even allowed to watch that kind of stuff. Regardless, my parents became even more strict with screen time, and I was given herbal tea before bed. Minimizing my screen time was one of the most frustrating things I experienced in my adolescence, so when my family went to sleep, I snuck in the living room. I was too afraid to turn on the TV, so I looked out the window instead. I usually didn't see anything exciting, but one evening, I saw my dad's best friend, Tony, standing on the sidewalk right outside of our apartment. It seemed very odd, like he was waiting for me. As soon as I pulled the curtain back, he was staring directly at me, smiling and waving. He was one of the first friends my parents met when they came to America. So I always knew him as Uncle Tony. He would usually slip me $20 when he came to visit, so I always made sure to greet him first. I gestured for him to come upstairs, and the moment I turned to unlock the door, there was a faint knock, so I quickly opened it. I invited him inside and offered to wake my dad as I brought an extra chair from the kitchen. Tony walked in, smiling, and I hurried to my parents' room. They were already sitting up asking if I opened the front door, to which I proudly announced that Uncle Tony was here. Dad ran to the living room to find the door open and the kitchen chair in the middle of the room. He was furious and he wanted answers, but I thought Tony had just gone downstairs to get something. After confirming that wasn't the case, Dad locked up and sent me to bed. I was so confused. I didn't know if I'd been dreaming or sleepwalking, but I knew better than to argue with Dad right then. I woke up at 10 in the morning, hoping Dad would leave for work before I had to face him, but I could hear my parents talking. Mom was crying, and Dad was on the phone. I came out of my room. Mom called me into the living room. She asked if I really saw Uncle Tony the previous night. Her eyes were red and puffy. When I said yes, she looked at my father in pure astonishment. Dad sat next to me and explained that Uncle Tony couldn't have been here because he passed away in a car accident on his way home from Tijuana. I burst into tears for many reasons. Even as I write this, my throat tightens because I loved him. He was like family. My parents gave me a look that was very sad, serious, and a little frightened all at the same time. And they said, if I see Tony again, to tell him we all love him and miss him. I never did see him again, but I think about him often. I did, however, realize that if I could see Uncle Tony, I might be able to see other spirits as well. I don't believe in heaven or hell, but I do believe there is an existence after this one. And all these years later, I'm still discovering new things. Of the many encounters I've had since, some entities were innocuous, and some were absolutely horrifying. So, I saw something tonight in the sky I can't wrap my head around. I was standing out in my driveway smoking a cigarette, talking to my girlfriend on the phone, when I noticed 3 lights clustered in the sky, 2 red and 1 bright blue. Didn't think much about it because I live near an airport. I just thought that it was a plane or something. And then I realized it wasn't moving, and there was no sound. I said something about it to my girlfriend, who cracked a joke about, if it's aliens, you're not allowed to get abducted while you're on the phone with me. Then, suddenly, the object moved in a very fast line for about 2 seconds, paused, then raced off in another direction, and went behind the tree line and out of view, but only for a few seconds, then zipped back into view and remained stationary for a few more seconds. maybe a minute, then began moving rapidly, before finally going behind the tree line, and it didn't reappear. I have no idea what it was. A drone, maybe. I do live a few hours from an Air Force base, so maybe an experimental military craft. As much as I would love for it to be aliens, I'm skeptical and rational enough not to rush to any conclusions, but what are your thoughts? Update. So I saw it again. Same thing, 3 lights in the sky. So I sort of followed it to see if I could confirm maybe it was a drone. As I followed it, I realized it was far away. Much too far for a drone, much too quiet for an airplane. Its rapid movements were unsettling, to say the least. I was tempted to call my girlfriend, but was pretty sure this was just a joke to her. I'm not saying it's anything serious, but it's not normal. I've just got to know. Has anyone else seen these lights? What are they? It happened almost 10 years ago, right before I got pregnant with my first child. My husband and I were driving to my sister's house to have some drinks and stay over. It was dark outside when we left our place, and the drive is about 15 miles. The first stretch of highway passes right by Lake Michigan, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. As soon as we pulled onto the highway, we both noticed an odd-looking star over the lake. It was the brightest light we'd ever seen. It would have been extremely hard for others to miss, but I'm not sure if anyone else was on the road. My attention was solely focused on the giant, blinding star. We thought it was amazing, but then it started moving. It went up, down, left, right. It seemed to be following us into town. My husband and I were transfixed. After we made it into town, we watched in disbelief as it rose even higher, shooting across the sky and out of sight. I was sad that it left and desperately hoping to catch another glimpse. It was such an indescribable feeling to see a giant light do all these impossible maneuvers, just dart across the sky and leave us in awe. The excitement and impossibility of it all made me feel like a kid again, full of wonder and joy. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen, and that's not even the best part. What happened next changed who I am as a person and the way I perceive things. We were only a few blocks away from my sister's house when my husband stopped at a stop sign and looked to his left. At that moment, I was looking ahead. I saw the craft 2 blocks ahead at streetlight level. It glided across the street effortlessly, without sound. This time, it had no lights. It just looked like a blimp without windows, strings, or anything else you might expect to see on a blimp. It was a dark, matte gray color and covered in very fine lines, indentations, seams. I don't know. It was a little larger than 2 car lengths, fast and silent. A moment later, it passed in front of our car, and I screamed, but it was gone before my husband could turn his head. I made him drive around and search for it for a long time so that I could try to get a picture, but we didn't see it again. We both spent most of the drive watching this bright light dance in the sky, perform all of these outstanding and impossible aerial maneuvers, just to have it disappear and reappear with no lights or noise. That makes me think it knew we were watching. I know in my soul that what I saw was something far beyond our understanding, and for a while after that, my sister and I would stargaze, but we never saw anything like what my husband and I saw that first night. Over the years, the excitement went away, more and more as life got busy. But last week, I was driving home when, out of nowhere, an unusually bright light appeared in the sky. It was almost like the other one I saw, but I hadn't quite made the connection yet. At first, I thought it must be a plane, but then I noticed the lights weren't flashing, and I couldn't hear anything. Then, it suddenly started to descend, as if it were falling, but it stopped just above the tree line. I pulled over to a gas station so I could watch it, but nothing happened for 15 minutes, so I decided to go home. It was almost a straight shot home. I just needed to take one left turn off the highway. I was about to take that turn when I looked to my right. I saw the bright light again. Instead of continuing home, I changed course to drive straight towards that light and FaceTimed my husband. It was a one-way road that you've got to drive all the way through to get out, so I couldn't change direction once I started following the light, and I was freaking out. It was now right in front of me. I drove too far in, and the trees covered my view. But when I fell back, it was gone. I've also recently watched the 5E documentary before my most recent sighting, and it made me wonder if the reason I saw the light again after so many years was because it had been on my mind like when I first saw it. The documentary speculates that they can be summoned with our thoughts and consciousness. Before I'd even heard of that theory, I felt like the reason I saw the craft was due to my elevated awareness from watching the light over the lake. The only thing going through my mind were huge amounts of wonder and excitement. This happened around 2013. I was around 8 years old at the time. I'd had a normal day at school, got into bed, but had that feeling that I wasn't alone. Moments later, I heard someone whisper my name loudly. It was a male's voice, standing in the back of my room. Scared, of course, I jumped off the bed and I slept in my parents' bed. The next few days, I'd hear footsteps, pacing back and forth. My sister, unbeknownst to me at the time, was scared of something too, and immediately agreed when I suggested sleeping together. It was like this until she wanted to sleep in her room with me. I said sure, but I was still creeped out, of course. That night, I woke up in the middle of the night for the second time. The first time she'd rammed her elbow into my face, but this time, I just saw that giant, dark figure in the middle of her room. It was see-through, but it didn't really have a shape. I bolted out of there. I only ever told her about it a few months ago. These hauntings stopped, but they started again back in 2019, and they continue, even now. I've been going back and forth as to whether or not to post this, since to an outside viewer, the video isn't really all that interesting. If you don't know me, you'd assume it was faked, or I was simply misjudging where noises were coming from. But after a few weeks, I want to get my experience down in writing. Despite being a fairly mundane story compared to some of the posts here, it really upset me. This took place a few weeks ago. I'm going to go into detail to describe my house. Skip this paragraph if you want to get to the good stuff. In the video, I'm sitting on a couch, the camera facing the doorway that leads to a hallway. That hallway has 4 bedrooms. As you can tell by the boxes, people have been moving in and out. The bedroom closest to the living room had my roommate's stuff in it, a bed, a carpet, etc., and the door was held open with a bag of clothes so that the cat could get in and out. Her closet was also propped open with the laundry hamper so the cat could use the litter box. The second room was my old room. I was in the process of moving my stuff to the third room. Neither of these rooms have a closet. The second room, the door was open a crack. In the third room, the door was closed. These rooms also don't have closets. The fourth room, with my roommate's stuff in it, the door was wide open. His closet was shut. It's an old building, and the doors don't click perfectly shut. You need to kind of wedge them open and closed by putting your weight on them. Note that you can slam the doors without them closing. They bounce back open. All doors do this. I was sitting on the couch alone, watching TV. I was sure I was home alone since my roommate, ERIN, asked me to watch her cat, and the guy in the back room, Mark, told me that he was going to stay with his girlfriend for a few days. But people come and go pretty often, so when I heard footsteps, I didn't really think twice. I've been living here for 2 years, and I can tell where noise is coming from. The footsteps sounded like they were coming from ERIN's room. That's when I heard her slam her door very hard. I was worried something was wrong, so I got up to check. I saw that her door was wedged open, and the room was dark, meaning she wasn't home. I looked up in the hallway. I saw Mark's room was wide open and also dark. He wasn't home either. I immediately got a chill because I didn't know where the noise was coming from. I've been living here nearly 2 years. I know every sound this house makes. I know that it was one of the bedroom doors. I was only sitting 10 feet away. I couldn't see the doors, but there's no mistaking that one of them was slamming. We're also the top apartment. We can't hear any noises from the downstairs neighbors ever, and there's nothing on either side of us. I went and sat back down. About 5 minutes later, the door slammed again. I got up, thinking maybe a window was open and blowing the door shut. This was unlikely since the 2 years I've lived here. The doors have never done this, even with every window in the house open. But I was still trying to rationalize it. So I checked the windows, and every window was tight shut. At this point, I was freaking out a little, went to sit down. As soon as I sat down, again, the door slammed, twice in a row, quickly. At this point, I know people will be rolling their eyes because I didn't get up and look again, but I was too scared to move. I have PTSD, and door slamming is a huge trigger for me, so my heart was already racing. But when I realized that there was no one in the house, I went into panic mode. I started texting a friend who lived nearby, telling him what was happening. Over the course of texting him for about half an hour, the door kept slamming. Sometimes every 30 seconds. Sometimes it would stop for 5 minutes. My friend was on his way, but he suggested I yell at it. I think he was just suggesting this because he thought it would give me confidence. So I yelled, "Please stop," as if, in response, the door slammed hard 3 times in a row. I literally was shaking at this point. I couldn't get up to even look if I wanted to. While waiting for my friend to come, it slowed down a bit, but this is when I finally realized I should take a video. In the short video, I got a quiet slam. In the long video, at the 34-second mark, I could clearly hear footsteps, which is why I said, "What the fuck was that?" At 42 seconds and 56 seconds, you can hear the door slam. When my friend got here, about 20 minutes later, it stopped. He thoroughly checked every single room and closet for an intruder. When he came back to the living room, he said that there was no one in the house. I finally calmed down enough to check myself. We spent about 15 minutes examining every door in the house. There was absolutely no reason for any of them to have been slamming like that. No windows were open. We were even testing out the hinges and shit, just trying to find a rational explanation. While I was in ERIN's room trying to find her cat, The thing was terrified, wedged itself behind her dresser. I was also burning incense. I'm into witchcraft, so I was beginning to do a light cleansing to get the negative energy out. My friend, who is a pretty tough dude, like he's been to jail and shit, he screamed. I ran out and he looked at me, white as a sheet. I've never seen him scared before, and he was scared. I have a poster in the living room of a band called Witchcross. It's been up for a year and a half at least. It's the blue poster that you can see on the right in the videos. There's 2 massive push pins in each corner. Apparently, while he was sitting there, both push pins flew out of the corners and dropped to the floor. There was no breeze, nothing to knock it down. The pins just flew out. Keep in mind, I had to hammer those pins in when I put that poster up a year and a half ago. It survived multiple house parties without falling down. I put the poster back up in the exact same spot, put the pins in the same holes, and it stayed up just fine ever since. My friend stayed with me, and the rest of the night, there were no more noises at all, even though we left the doors exactly how they were. A few days later, I messaged my old roommate. I didn't tell him what happened. I just asked if he'd ever experienced anything weird in this apartment. He said he didn't want to tell me because he didn't want to scare me, but part of the reason he moved out was because of the bad experiences he had here. This is not a superstitious guy at all. He also told me that 3 years ago, before we moved in, a girl killed herself in one of the front rooms. My roommate told me when he lived here, he had reoccurring dreams of a girl kicking in his door, jumping on him. Then, about 2 years ago, my old roommate's friend went on the roof, tried to kill himself in the little gap between the 2 front bedroom windows. So, there's definitely some bad energy here. I know this isn't proof to anyone who doesn't know me, because in order to believe this video, you'd have to take me at my word. And I'm just a stranger on the internet. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get up and get a video of the door actually slamming, but I was genuinely terrified by that time. I wish I thought to get more video, but when something like this happens, your first thought isn't, how am I going to prove this to the world? It's, what do I need to do to keep myself safe? At first, I thought someone had snuck into my house, was going to hurt me. All I could think of is what to use as a weapon. I couldn't even leave out the back door to my left because my shoes were down the hall. Sorry if you were expecting a crazier story, but this is one of the most fucked up things I've ever experienced. I've always been a bit of a skeptical believer, and if someone else posted this, I probably wouldn't believe it. I've been practicing magic for over 10 years, and I'm confident what I would like to do in this situation. I'm posting to share my experience and to see if anyone notices anything about the video or audio that I didn't notice, or has any other insights on the actual experience. Thank you. I was 12 when this happened. My brother, older cousin, and I grew up on a reservation near a mountain. There's several towns and a city just 5 miles away from our hometown, but as teens we played by an old creek near my house. In May of 2008, we spent a couple of hours having a water gun fight there. As I was filling my gun, I saw what looked like a bear's left arm from the shoulder joint. It was covered in brown fur, rotten green meat, and a little blood. I pulled it out of the mud, and it was exactly like a human hand. It had a palm with fingers and nails, but much larger. I screamed and fetched my brother and cousin so that they could look at it too. They wanted to bring it home, but we vomited repeatedly due to the stench. It was also heavy, so we took turns carrying it until we finally were able to show our uncle and grandmother. They were angry with us for touching it, let alone taking it, so our uncle put it into his wheelbarrow and walked away. He returned a few hours later, without the arm. Our grandmother told us a story that she had heard from her father. She told us to stay away from the mountains because they've been occupied longer than we've been on this earth. She didn't believe the story, so she went toward the mountains to look for berries and tree sap. But when she got closer, she saw what looked like 4 large bears standing on the mountainside, and they were walking like men. She called them Bigfoot. I never spoke of it or even mentioned it again until a couple of years ago, when I asked my grandmother what she thought happened to the rest of that arm's body. She said that Bigfoot are like bears, extremely territorial and aggressive when scared or threatened. Her grandfather used to burn their bones whenever one died. That way, the white people wouldn't find them and hunt the rest. Years later, 2021, my cousin and I returned to that mountain for a hunting trip, but we only found a giant teepee hut with thick brown hair inside. I showed my grandmother the pictures to see if she remembered anything similar, and she did. She even had 4 Polaroid pictures of her own, showing other giant teepee huts, and one photo with 3 large bear-like creatures walking upright like a human. She made me promise to never tell or show anyone the photos. She doesn't think anyone would believe us either way, but worries for them, I think. We've spent the majority of our lives in the bush, hunting and fishing. I'm still questioning things so much. Life is different now. My people call it Bigfoot, or some of you might call it Sasquatch. Either way, it's just like another person. They won't bother us if we don't bother them. On February 27th, 2023, my friend was driving home from work down a country road between 5 and 6 p.m. He saw an unknown creature less than a mile from my house. It was at the road's edge, as if it were about to cross. It was pitch black, very furry, with a bobbed tail. It had a pit bull's face, jowls, ears. It was slender but muscular, and it stood on all 4s. It saw my friend but paid him no attention. Instead, it turned around slowly and leapt back into the woods like a frog, with its legs splayed in opposite directions. It was roughly the size of a Great Dane, but he couldn't identify much else. This was in a wooded area next to a small bayou, and there's a nook that leads into the woods. That same night, I heard strange thuds and wood bowing sounds around midnight, like something was climbing a wooden structure. Not sure if it's related, but 6 years ago, I saw something strange leap between one section of the woods to another, across the highway, about a half mile from my house. It was black, hairy, and ape-like. 3 years ago, my wife and I heard tapping on the window around midnight. We laughed at first, but my cousin, who lived across the street, called and said something big was in our yard, and he said that it had run into the woods. We investigated and heard it rustling through trees, but never saw it. The next morning, there was a large, bare, humanoid footprint outside the window that we heard the tapping at. That same year, a friend and I were hanging out, and I saw something strange walk into my cousin's yard. It was large, black, and furry. It walked on all 4s, and it looked like a pig, but we couldn't determine what it was. It had a dog-like snout with the stature and size of a hog or a large bear cub. It sniffed a circle around his house and went back into the woods. Last year, I was driving on my road at night, and there's a curve about a half a mile where my friend saw the creature. In the curve, my headlights shined into the woods and revealed eyes shining 6 feet off the ground. I stopped the car to examine it, but I didn't see anything else. I only noticed the smell of rotting meat as it flooded the car, and I promptly left. Not too long after that incident, I was outside at midnight, heard a strange noise in my cousin's yard. I shined a flashlight over there, saw a shiny pair of eyes at average height. It looked at me and continued walking toward the woods. In my experience, most things come to a stop when you spotlight them, but not this thing. I continued to shine the light into the woods, and it returned 15 feet further down the tree line, where it stared back at me before turning back. I continued shining the light and caught it once more in the same place. It looked at me for another moment and turned away. I didn't see it again, but I had an eerie feeling that it was sentient. For the past 2 weeks, my entire property has stank of skunk. Our house gets sprayed from time to time, but the smell usually dissipates after 2 days. This time, it's been almost 2 weeks, and the smell is even pungent by the road. My house seems to be the epicenter. The smell extends roughly 100 yards around my house in all directions. I considered all of these instances to be strange coincidences until my friend saw that creature yesterday. Now I'm not ruling them out as possible encounters. Any and all guesses as to what the nature of this creature is are appreciated. When I was 3, my mom and I followed my dad to Oregon from San Fernando Valley in California. My dad transferred to Oregon City to open a new Home Depot. This was in 1997, so it was an even smaller city back then, and we lived out in the sticks, as my mom called it. The house was beautiful, though. It was situated in a solitary little clearing with a long gravel driveway through the trees. Our dining room doors opened up to a big lawn on a hill, and the front entry led to the finished basement downstairs, or the main house upstairs. In the main house's hallway, my room was the first door on the right, and my parents' room was the last on the left. The first couple incidents aren't too weird. I'd ask my dad to close the blinds so the monsters couldn't see me, even though we were on the second floor, and I'd run to my parents in pure terror almost every night. Maybe this is just a child adjusting to a new environment, but I don't know. I have such vivid memories of my panic as I ran down that hallway. So I'll tell these next two in chronological order. For the first one, my aunt said that she came to visit me when she was 13 and I was 4. My room was weird. My closet had 2 giant rolling mirrors for doors, and they took up half of the wall next to my bed. The bedroom door was opposite of my bed, and I had a wooden rocking chair in the far corner. My bed was against a wall, and my aunt was sleeping on the inside while I was on the outside. She woke up to see that I was awake, staring at the rocking chair, because it was rocking. She asked what was going on. I said that there was a lady in the chair. She asked what the lady wanted. I told my aunt that she wanted to read me a story. My aunt said to let her, and she said I gave her the biggest "what the fuck" look she'd ever seen. Then she said that there was nothing we could do, roll over and pass out. I personally don't remember the experience, but I vividly remember this next one, which happened a couple of weeks later. After my aunt left, I missed her terribly, and I ran to my parents' room, where I sat on the bed and stared at the door, like I was waiting for something. Then, suddenly, a rainbow-colored woman walked in. She and her dress were shimmery, multicolored, but almost muted. She sat at the foot of the bed, leaned towards me, saying that I would be okay, that my aunt would eventually come back. Then she left. That's the end of the memory. I also used to dream that I'd be looking at my body from above and suddenly fall into it. When I'd instantly wake up, the whole bed would be shaking, like I'd just jumped on it. Thanks for reading. Much love to you all, and please, let me know what you think about the woman. I've been thinking about her for the last 25 years. In 2006, I stayed overnight with a buddy at a second property his family had purchased. It was an old farm just on the outskirts of Florin Road, Watt Avenue, in Sacramento, California. My buddy's family had not moved in. He wanted to spend the night on the property to get a feel for it. The previous property owner's husband had passed away, and she sold the home for cheap. What struck me as odd was that she left all of the furniture, tons of miscellaneous personal property behind, which we discovered later had belonged to her late husband. I told my friend to get rid of all that junk because in my culture, Laotian Thai, we believed it was bad luck to hang on to a deceased person's property, the superstition being that the dead might come back and look for their property. On that particular night, I spent the night on the couch in the living room. My buddy was sleeping on the floor next to me. I could not fall asleep, but heard my buddy snoring loudly. Therefore, I knew he was in a deep sleep and did not witness the events soon to follow. As I'm slowly drifting off to sleep, I heard the closet door, located about a car length from my feet, slowly open. I knew it opened because it made this creaking noise from when the door swings on its hinges. At that point, I became fully alert, but I kept my eyes closed. I could hear my heart beating out of my chest. I was laying on my back and faced the ceiling. I slightly opened my eyes, glanced toward the closet. It was a full moon, so the living room was well lit. That's when I saw it. A black shadow coming towards me from inside the open closet. It had the silhouette of a man and stood approximately 7 feet tall, 2 feet wide. It crept towards me, and I was so scared I just closed my eyes, froze in place. I felt paralyzed, and I was on the verge of shitting and pissing myself. I kept my eyes closed, remained still for what felt like 5 minutes. Then the second half, and most scary, of the paranormal bullshit began. The blanket I'd have draped over my body slowly began pulling off my body. I could feel parts of my upper torso getting cold as the blanket pulled away from my skin towards my feet. I felt each hair on my skin stand because it was so cold. As the blanket continued pulling away and got closer to my feet, I whispered my buddy's name multiple times, repeating, "Dennis, Dennis, wake the fuck up. Something's going on in here." Dennis eventually stopped snoring and said, "What the fuck, man? I'm trying to sleep." After that, all the paranormal stuff stopped. I wrapped multiple blankets around me and slept in the prone position for the remainder of the night. I never had a more scary paranormal experience. I also have not been back to my buddy's farm since the incident. Sometimes weird things happen, and they just can't be explained. That night still bothers me to this day. I think the event took place sometime shortly after midnight. I thought the couch I was sleeping on was my buddy's, but later discovered it was part of the property that was left behind from the previous owner. I think her late husband came back from the dead to reclaim his couch. For a little backstory, I live in a small southern city with a history dating back to the Civil War. The apartment building I call home and have called home for almost 4 years now was built in 1936 to be apartments, instead of existing as a house first, only to be then converted into apartments. The walls and floors of this place are tremendously paper thin, as I can hear my downstairs neighbor's TV and my downstairs neighbor's if she's talking loud enough. There's squirrels in the walls that I can hear scrambling from time to time, and I can hear every time the front door opens and shuts, generally because people slam it. I say all this to say, yes, I know there's additional, rational, logical explanations for all sorts of things. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for the heavy footsteps I sometimes hear in my downstairs neighbor's apartment, which sounds like she's put the heaviest pair of hiking boots on, which I'd be surprised if she owns, and then paces, doing her best to stomp heavily with every step. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for the knocking I'll hear sometimes on the bathroom wall, which sounds very much like my other neighbor is racking his knuckles against his side of the wall. I'm even sure there's a logical explanation for the shadow of an arm I saw in my dark kitchen once and only back in 2020. I was staring at it from the living room. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for any and all little creepy things that have happened while I've lived here. I can find no explanation for this next part. This was about a week ago. I was about to go to sleep, sitting on the couch. I sleep on my couch because the living room is the only room I can somewhat climate control, be it through heater or fans. I was playing some solitaire to sort of relax. It was a particularly noisy evening that night. The train was whistling and groaning as it made its way down the tracks. The squirrels were scrabbling in the walls, and I could hear my neighbors moving around. In truth, I was a little unnerved by all the noise. But then, in the midst of everything else, I hear it.
Uh-oh.
It was a small voice, toneless, either a young woman or a child. It wasn't muffled. Didn't sound like it was coming from the TV or from one of the neighbors. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen or my bedroom. I stopped, paralyzed, listening, and hear nothing. Ever since then, I've heard nothing else, and no explanation for it. There's no grand ghost story attached to this place. The only thing that comes close, a half-remembered story from the old landlord about some little girl going missing here at some point. Even he hadn't heard about it himself. He'd only heard about it from a woman doing research for a ghost walk. It could be nothing, and I probably won't ever hear anything else, just like the Civil War nurse at my college. But I know what I heard. I know what it wasn't, even if I don't know what it was. That's what counts, right? A little while ago, I posted about hearing a girl or a young woman utter the words, "uh-oh," one night in my apartment where I live alone. Since then, I've started compiling a list of weird things that have happened in the apartment. I thought I might go over what's happened in my apartment since I moved in and see what other people think. It really started back in 2021. I'd moved into the apartment in late 2019, and for a year and a half I'd lived there. I hadn't noticed anything very strange, or at least anything strange enough that stuck in my mind. This would change very shortly. While I was hanging out with some friends in a Discord voice chat one afternoon, I happened to glance down the length of my hallway, the doorway of which is to the left of where I sit. Just by turning my head, I can look down the hallway into the dining room, and from the dining room, I can see my desk. Well, when I looked to my left that particular afternoon, I saw what looked like the shadow of a woman's arm in the doorway of the dining room, as if the woman it was connected to was standing just on the inside of the dining room, out of sight. Now, it might have just been the shadows, but I know I saw it clearly enough that it caught my attention, and it was still there after I looked away once or twice. It was clear enough that I was about to tell the Discord chat about it, but it finally disappeared, and I convinced myself I hadn't seen anything. A few months later, sometime around November 2021, February 2022, I was woken up one night to what I can only describe as a choir singing. It sounded like All the World, and as if people were singing it in my room. Now, there is a church next door, but I've never heard them practice before, and this was like 3 a.m. I lay there, fully awake and confused, until the noise finally stopped, and I once again convinced myself that I'd imagined it, that it was only a very late-night practice for the church next door. Now, this one, over a year later, earlier this year, I was sitting on the couch in the living room, playing some solitaire on my phone, preparing to go to bed. As I'm sitting there, fully awake and aware of all the noises around me, mainly the train that had just rumbled its way through town, I hear in the silence that followed a young woman or child's voice, clear as day, saying, "Uh-oh," from the direction of the dining room. Now I've heard other people's TVs from the apartment. They're all muffled and quiet. This wasn't. This was clear and loud. A couple of weeks after that, I'm in the dining room, bent over, grabbing a couple of water bottles from the cask in the corner of the room. I catch movement out of the corner of my eye. I watch from between my legs as something, a lady's skirt maybe, moves from one corner of the room to the other. Again. This isn't me seeing something I thought I saw and then wasn't there when I went to look. I watched as whatever this was moved across the floor for several seconds. Why I never thought to stand up and turn around, I'll never know. Finally, just last night, I was listening to someone on YouTube talk about film in the 1980s, when suddenly, along with the audio from the video, I heard something that sounded like a woman's wordless, barely audible, whispering right by my left ear. I stopped. I frowned, rewound the video to where I'd just heard it, and it simply wasn't there. Wasn't in the video. Had never been in the video. I'm becoming more and more convinced that my apartment is haunted, but I'm still not 100% certain that it is. I guess I'd have to concretely engage with something before I believed it. What do you good people think? I've recently moved into an apartment in the historic part of a medium-sized town. The atmosphere is great, everyone seems friendly, and I get to walk twice a day for about an hour. Even the dogs that, despite feel they need to bark at me, are pretty friendly. The only fly in the ointment is the guy who lives a little ways down from me, who may be a bit too friendly. Not long after I moved in, I started doing my walks, and I would notice the older man sitting out on his porch some evenings. I'd nod at him, he'd nod at me. We might exchange greetings, normal neighbor stuff. A few weeks into this routine, I'm walking back to my apartment, passing his house. He's out there again as usual, but this time calls out to me, stating how he always sees me walking. I respond that, yeah, I do it twice a day, and he invites me to come up and sit on his porch and talk. Now, Mama might have raised me to be polite, but she didn't raise no fool. So I politely declined and continued the short conversation from the grass in front of his house. After a few minutes, I excuse myself and walk back to my apartment. The next few days went on as routine, until one evening he's sitting on his porch, listening to somebody playing electric guitar on a radio. I mean, some really psychedelic stuff. He calls out to me, I stop, and he asks if I like the music. I said yeah. In truth, it wasn't really my thing, but again, wanted to be polite. So he invites me to come sit up on his porch and listen to it. I again decline, stating I had somewhere to be, and he grouses jokingly that I need to stop making excuses. I again take my leave, feeling even more unnerved than previously. Several more weeks pass and I'm walking by his house when he suddenly bellows, "Boy!" at me from his porch. I stop and turn to face him. I have a thing about people being too familiar with me. I hate being called bud or buddy, so automatically I'm on edge. He asks why he hasn't seen me in the last few days. I explain that I've been walking at the same time every evening, and again he invites me to come up and sit on his porch. I again decline. After several days of walking, I'm out one morning a couple of days ago, doing my normal rounds when I pass this guy in sunglasses and a hat mowing his lawn. I squeeze past him and the guy turns and demands to know why I didn't even stop to say hi. Surprise, it's my buddy. I state rightly that I didn't recognize him, and he suddenly changes the subject, asking what I do. I tell him I'm a writer. It's really more of a passion than a simple job, but it's the best answer I had. He says that he's wrote before, but probably never something as creative as I've done, which is mildly creepy considering I never told him I wrote fiction. He then says he wants to read some of my writing, says to bring it up to his porch one day, but helpfully tacking on that if he's not there, I should just knock because he's probably in the basement, where apparently his office is. Thoroughly creeped out by the fact that this dude is ticking all the red flags, I continue my walk. Several hours later, in the evening, I'm walking by his house when I see him come out of his house with his back to me. He hadn't seen me. He's fiddling with something on his porch. I slow down because I'm curious, and because somewhere in my brain, I guess I decided it would be rude not to say hi. He turns around after setting up the speaker again, telling me to come sit down and listen to music. Now I was meeting some friends a few minutes later and thusly declined, citing the fact that they were waiting on me. He immediately half-jokingly accused me of lying and says that I won't get anywhere in life by not telling the truth. Before then, inviting that I hadn't had anything to do all day, I argued that yes, I did. He finally drops the subject and lets me go. I'm walking away from him and that's when I hear it. His screen door swinging shut. The man had gone out on his porch and set up the music, just to try to get me to go up there with him. That was the last time I went that way. The next morning, changing my pattern entirely to avoid his house. This is where the I need advice portion is. In your humble opinions, am I blowing this out of proportion? Is this just some lonely, retired old man reaching out to the one person that he sees on a regular basis? Or is this somebody with a much darker agenda, trying to get me into a position where I'm easy to incapacitate, be dragged back into his house or office? Either way, I'm avoiding creepy guy because I'm not sure how I feel about someone who keeps trying to get me onto their porch. So about a month back, I posted my experiences walking in the evening, where I was harassed by a kid on a bicycle and ran into a lady wanting me to go get her formula for her baby. Thankfully, I had no problem with the lady. I haven't seen her since. The boy, though. I appear to have made quite an impression on him. After the initial incident, for context, he rode his bike in circles around me, popping on the sidewalk behind me in an attempt to rattle me, then shouted, "Yeah, you better run," when I finally crossed the street into a busy downtown. I didn't see anything of this kid or his absent friend for the better part of a month. Or rather, I don't remember seeing him. He might have been in that same parking lot, but never bothered me. Never occurred to me to pay attention to him. That changed 2 days ago. I was almost done with my evening walk, talking to somebody on the phone as I often do, just to give me something to do while I'm circling the neighborhood. I turned down a street that intersects near where I live, preparing to turn onto my street and go eat some dinner. It's then that I hear the sound coming up from behind me. Bicycle wheels. As I'm walking and talking, this kid, the same one as before, rides his bike up on me on the other side of the street and starts hurling insults, most of which I don't hear. The only one that I do consciously remember being able to decipher was a baffling, "Why are you on the phone?" "Because I've got a social life, guy. What business is it of yours?" As is my wont in those situations, I do my due diligence to ignore the child, assuming that engaging with him in any way is only going to lead to more harassment as he realizes he's going to get a rise out of me. The kid keeps up this barrage of nonstop motor-mouthing unintelligible insults until he finally turns and starts pedaling back. Either because he'd grown tired of trying to get a rise out of somebody that he couldn't, or because I'd crossed and was out of his hunting grounds. I went in, laughed it off, and didn't think much of it. He was annoying, but other than trying to ram me with his bicycle, he seemed harmless. He was just a kid who thought he owned the world because of his age. Again, seemed perfectly harmless. Yesterday goes by without incident. No sight of him, and I managed to walk in peace. Tonight, that almost all changed. I went on my normal walk as per usual, having to amend my path as I have sometimes to avoid large crowds of people and open tables on the road. I'm not the biggest people person in the whole wide world. Crowds of any size tend to unnerve me. I've circled back and started walking by the parking lot, the one that the kid with the bicycle is usually in. No bicycle this time. Nope, just a kid. I'm walking on the sidewalk, aware of this young teenager to my left, keeping an eye on him. I don't trust him. I don't know what he might do if provoked. Almost absently, my eyes wander to the sidewalk in front of me, just to make sure I'm not about to run into a tree or something. My heart drops to my shoes when I see it. The kid has a friend with him. A friend who's currently standing facing me on the far end of the sidewalk that I'm walking down. He's eyeing me, arms crossed. And though I'm not sure, I'm pretty certain he's got a bat in his hands. Momentarily, I consider just walking up to and slipping past this kid, just to see what he'll do. I can be stubborn at times, particularly if I feel like someone's trying to do something to me. Thankfully, logic and safety won out on this one. I quickly slipped off the sidewalk, still walking ahead but through the grass, keeping an interspersed line of trees between me and the would-be assailants. The first boy, the one in the parking lot, starts walking the same way I am, adjacent to me, matching, step by step. I finally make my way past the boy with the bat, and then turn, going my normal route again. Glancing back, I see both boys eyeing me, watching me as I leave. I don't have any more incidents for the rest of my walk, but I keep my head on a swivel, just in case one of them decides to follow me, especially the one with the bat. So, kid on a bicycle, and your friend, who I hope to never meet again, let's not meet again, ever again. These are some of the experiences I had while working in a haunted house type place one October in my hometown. First thing I want to make clear, this building was super old. From what I can tell and find on the internet, it was built in 1916 and was originally a hotel. It had gone through several different owners throughout the years and was at one point a hospital, at another point an apartment building. It stood abandoned for a long time, but every few years, someone would try to raise money to do something with the building. Eventually, the local high school drama teacher bought it, turned it into a haunted house experience. I was brought in one year as a substitute actor, but ended up with an actual position because the girl who was working in my room refused to work in there alone. For a while, she tried to stop people from telling me why. But eventually I learned that she was standing in the shower in the room, hiding alone. Something or someone scratched her back, pretty bad. She still worked there, but she refused to be alone. The first thing that I noticed about the room was it had a very bad vibe. I hated being there alone every night because the room just felt off. The second thing I noticed about the room was the rocking horse in the corner of the room. It was strung up so that it would be hanging in the corner of the room, and it would just rock all the time. It wasn't like I was pushing it all the time or like there was a particularly strong breeze. It just rocked a lot. The next thing I noticed was that there was a super loud sound of running water behind me all the time. The pipes in the building didn't work at all, so water shouldn't have been going through them. It also wasn't raining or anything. I never figured out what that sound was. The other thing that happened a lot in that building was our technology stopped working a lot. Our lights and sounds that we were using would randomly stop all of the time, but it wasn't like it was a total power outage or anything. It was just our strobe lights and our speakers. There were also a couple of nights where I would take my phone out of the box that all the actors put their phones in, and my phone would go all wacky. It's been years at this point, so I don't remember all the details, but when I turned my phone on, it was some sort of black-blue screen with colored or white text that covered the entire screen. I was able to fix it, but it was weird that it only ever happened there. That's all I remember at the time. But if anyone has questions, I'm willing to answer them. Been a while since I shared this story. Background: I worked as an off-shift IT guy in a 24/7 federal building while trying to finish college. My shift, 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. I can't say too much, but it used to be many things, like a sanitarium, a hospital. Very popular in the 1800s. It had its own underground network of tunnels to move supplies and bodies in and out of the building. Train station, cemeteries. During my shift, I worked in 2 physical locations, the call center area and a secure communications room. The most frightening times I had was when I worked in the building's sub-basement. It used to be the building's morgue, but was now the exclusively secure communications room. Since it's 24/7, the lights stay on in that communications room at all times. There's always someone required to be in the room. Didn't matter if it felt like you were being watched anyway. Also, no one was allowed to be in that room alone. Our customers who we support made sure that one of us was in there with them while working. Minimum staffing in that room was 3 people during the day. At night, my shift, 2. Anyway, my story specifically was, as I was wrapping up my homework thesis, I heard a noise, like something heavy being dragged on the other side or opposite of my cubicle. I called my friend over. He heard it too. My cube wall is pretty long, but in the few minutes for my friend to come over, we both heard it for about 5 to 7 minutes. We asked each other if there was anyone else in our secure area, or if any last-minute work was scheduled. Nope. We made the choice to investigate the noise in the area. Nope, nothing. Room doors still locked, No one else but us entered or was present. Took a smoke break and left, just to not run away screaming. People would complain that when they used the common restroom, someone would tug at their clothing while they were in there. It would always freak them out. The worst parts for me would be when I had to walk this huge Gothic building at night and in the dark and manually update computers. Security guards would make their rounds and shut off all of the lights in the areas not used, and I'd go and turn them all on when I did my rounds. Anyway, I'd see and hear things. Shadows appear when I turned on the lights and murmurs at specific places. During the day, when it's sunny, heavily populated, lots of people, you don't notice anything odd. At night, and it's just you and the other guy, hearing noises and seeing things, it's scary as hell. The building is still occupied. I'm told those areas are no longer available or accessed. They're now used for storage only. My younger brother and I have lived near the desert our whole lives. We're extremely experienced campers. I'm 20 and I've never believed in anything paranormal until last night. But my brother, he's always been able to see and sense jinns. They're basically demons. We always go to the same place when we want to camp with minimum effort, and the beginning of our day was completely normal. But the closer we got to our destination, the more I noticed my brother's mood shifting. When I asked him what was wrong, he shrugged me off, just said to keep driving. I felt fine when we got there, but my brother was unusually quiet. It was the afternoon, and we planned to leave at midnight. The heat was intense, so we set up under a few trees near some water. In the Middle East, it's said that that's where jinns live, but I didn't believe that. As we set up our tent, it fought us. We would secure one end and another end would pop up. When finished, it looked as if something was pushing on it, which is something neither of us have ever experienced, not even during a sandstorm. When my brother feels a presence, he gets extremely unlucky. After almost dropping a box of coals on his foot, he spilled a Coke on his phone, smashed his elbow, and cut his finger. He was digging in his bag when he found an unsheathed knife, but he said it felt like someone actually pushed his finger into it. This was all in a matter of hours, and it made us feel uneasy. Suddenly, a random couple appeared out of nowhere, saying they were stuck in the sand and needed help. We were driving a Land Cruiser. They said that they had a Nissan Altima, so we didn't expect to encounter many issues, but we were wrong. We dug them out easily, but they somehow got stuck again as we pushed them, even though there was plenty of space available to grip. Later, my brother said that's when he really started to feel an evil presence, but he didn't want to freak me out. We ended up towing the couple out of the sand, but it was much harder than it should have been. Our strap pulled off their bumper, and we almost got stuck ourselves. When we returned to camp, everything became unusually quiet. The only sound was that of our rapidly dying fire. As we sat down to eat, my brother suddenly grabbed my hand, and he said we needed to go as quickly as possible. The fear in his voice and on his face were obvious. He didn't feel safe. So we prayed to ease our minds, but it only angered whatever was there. We quickly finished eating, but I was only humoring my brother until I suddenly had a nagging feeling that we should leave. It hit me like a wave, and I said so. We started packing. That's when we heard something on the opposite side of the small pond. I can only describe it as the sound of death. It lasted for several minutes. I felt like I was having a heart attack. After remaining frozen for a few minutes, we drove closer so we could look around with the headlights, but things got really crazy once the screaming stopped. At first, we heard twigs snapping and footsteps all around us. Then we saw shadows behind the trees. I tried everything to get those shadows to change shape. I walked around the trees, moved the lights, but nothing happened. It looked and felt like people were staring at us. We felt like we weren't alone, and that the entities weren't friendly. We also noticed 3 cats huddled behind our car, away from the trees, but thankfully they left as we started reversing. They looked terrified, and they were staring at the trees. It felt like whatever was there was getting closer, but luckily, we were able to pack up quickly. All was silent as we did so. I was most terrified while driving back to the main dirt path. I could tell the steering was off, like it was fighting against me, but that stopped the second we were on the highway. The sound of snapping twigs still surrounded us, and it was loud enough to be heard over the car. The path was covered in birds. They just stood there, staring until we got close. Then they walked away. My brother said to keep looking straight ahead. Under no circumstances was I to look through his window. We were in a part of the desert where we had to drive through the whole of inaccessible areas to get onto the highway. There were no other people around. The only thing we saw was an abandoned Toyota Helix positioned behind a small sand dune, hidden by the trees, but it was far enough from our campsite to be ruled out as the source of anything we'd heard. As we were nearing the exit, we saw a deer standing in the middle of the path, staring directly at us. In 16 years where we're from, I've only seen 1 deer, and that was someone's pet. I was in shock. The deer wouldn't move until we were close enough to smell it. Then, it slowly walked away while looking right at us. We quickly drove past it. My brother gasped before sternly saying to keep my eyes on the road. As we got on the highway, I asked what he kept seeing, and he reluctantly described large figures around us anytime we went around a bend. They were either pointing at us or ahead of us. I'm glad he didn't tell me until later. We still hadn't encountered anyone, but we heard sounds all around us. I was thrilled to finally see the exit, but that quickly faded when we saw another deer standing in the middle of the road. This one slowly walking away, but still looking at us. Only this time, it looked more like a kangaroo mixed with a deer. It had milky eyes, looked rotten, but I didn't care. I just stepped on the gas and was glad it got out of the way in time. At the exit, I was about to turn right when my brother said to turn left instead, towards a small town. He saw another line of figures pointing ahead of us and didn't think that we would make it home in one piece if we followed their directions. The further we drove, the less we felt like we were being watched. I was distraught. My brother said that that's because we were alone. The jinn wanted to cause us harm. They get you in rural places, so you're forced to stop, and then they can do whatever they want. That's why there were so many animals on our path. He also said that they cause bad luck. He'd felt them from the second we entered the desert. Before this, I always just dismissed his feelings as him being afraid. I can excuse the sounds, shadows, and the feelings of being watched, but I can't excuse the 2 deer or the car randomly fighting against me. It's safe to say we're not camping there anymore, and I'll never again dismiss my brother when it comes to his sense of these things. I'm just so thankful we made it home safely. This happened to me several years ago, back when I was a teenager. I've never really told many people about it, but the memory has always stuck with me. Some background. I've always believed in paranormal. I've experienced other things, but nothing quite to this extent. I grew up in Arkansas, and as a family in a smaller city, we spent a lot of time outdoors, fishing, hunting, camping, etc. I was about 16 when my dad and I decided to go hunting on some land owned by a longtime family friend. I grew up hunting out there and was familiar with the majority of the property. My dad had been out prior and scoped a few good spots to sit and wait. He took me to a dry creek that I wasn't entirely familiar with. It had a raised island in the middle of it. It was like 4 or so feet higher than the creek bed. There was a fallen tree on top of it. He had me sit on the stump. He left me there and went to whatever location he'd picked for himself. I waited there for a while, not really hearing or seeing anything. I eventually laid my gun down on the ground at my feet, stood up to stretch a little. I remember suddenly feeling a little odd. While I was stretching, I started hearing thuds. It sounded like a horse running, or a deer maybe, but it sounded heavier. I could hear whatever it was, but couldn't see anything. I was in the middle of the woods, and I heard no leaves being rustled around or anything. Only the thuds. Before I could react, I felt a hard shove on the center of my chest, and I fell backwards off of the little hill that I was on. It pushed the breath out of me and scared me to death. After the hit, there was no more noise. Nothing running away, just silence. The entire experience freaked me out. And of course, when I yelled and finally found my dad, he didn't believe me. Has anyone else experienced anything similar to this? I've seen and heard things before, but I've never been touched or hit. What could this be? So right now, my garage is being rebuilt, and one of the doors is gone because the whole frame needs to be rebuilt, and it's taking longer than expected. There's no door at the moment. No big deal. It's just a garage. The house will survive if a raccoon or something gets in. But I'm not kidding. This happened just like 20 minutes ago. My cat ran outside behind me, and like an hour after that happened, I could hear him and the neighbor's cat fighting. I try to keep my cat inside, but he's fast. He'll run between my legs and right out the door. Okay, so cat got out. Him and the other cat are making some noise. Pretty average night so far. And then they get louder and a bit louder. And then I hear what had to have been a fox, but Jesus, it sounded like a recording of a human. Like, I'm not lying, and I guess I'm pretty sure it was a fox, but you know what? Fox, Cthulhu, either way, I'm not gonna go back out tonight. Fuck that. So, why am I posting this? I've had experiences with skinwalkers before. I've got another story out there. I sort of thought that it had lost interest in me because it's been a few years, but after hearing that scream, just, no thanks. I'll stay inside. I don't know how many people will read this or how many will believe it. Frankly, I don't care. I know that this happened, my brother knows it, and even local law enforcement believes some of it. This happened on a ranch that my brother and I lease in eastern Montana. The ranch in question is massive, covering about 18 sections. A section is 1 square mile, or 640 acres, and it's 2/3 deeded, the rest being either BLM or state-owned. This land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, where hundreds of years ago the natives would chase the herds of buffalo off the cliffs to their death. You can find buffalo bones at these sites. Supposedly, the ranch was also the site of a massacre, where an entire village of Hidatsa were killed by their enemies, the Sioux, although I haven't found any official records of that incident. Also on the ranch are 2 abandoned homesteads, the Mint Place and the Carter Place. The Mint homestead is merely 1 mile off the county road and relatively easy to access. So my brother and I still use the dated cattle pens that are part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only being accessible on horseback as the trail that went into it washed out many years ago. All that's left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with a roof caving in. an old corral system, and a barn that has toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house was the Carter family themselves. But during the 1930s, the father went crazy, murdered the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least that's what people said. The ranch's current owners live in California and have owned the ranch since purchasing it from the Mint family. This was during the 1980s. My brother and I started leasing the ranch in 2007. There was some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The real strangeness began in 2017, after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for strays on horseback when I was approached by two frantic hunters. The hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive. There hadn't been any wolves in the area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed they knew the difference between coyotes and wolves, and were absolutely certain that what was stalking them was wolves. Whatever it was had seriously bothered them. Later in the year, we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place. We found out that we were a dozen head short. Despite us running 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd. It was unusual to lose more than two. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we could not find the missing cattle. This began a trend, and so far since 2017, there have been a total of 138 unaccounted cattle, a financial loss of $165,000. Though there are many odd events that I could recount, this is one that stands out. This took place in October of 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them to the Mint homestead, where they could be loaded onto trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this point, the weird activity on the ranch had increased, so much so that we never went to the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception. Strapped to the saddle under my left leg was a Winchester .30-30 rifle. The morning went well. By noon, we'd gathered 200 head, which we penned up at the Mint place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down a canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I cannot describe what these howls sounded like because they were like nothing I'd heard, not before or since. As I continued riding in the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse, Ace, seemed to pick up on this as well, began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he was usually a very calm and collected horse. The second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of the old log cabin and ran in the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lenses chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive, solid black. It was so large it could have been mistaken for a black bear, but it was undeniably canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around, come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that the wolf I saw was nothing more than a coyote, and its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived back at the Mint place, herding 30 head of cattle in front of me. After I penned the cattle up, I led Ace back to my pickup and horse trailer. From a distance, I could see that something was wrong with the trailer. As I approached, I found that the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me. It was fine when I drove it in, but there was no explanation as to what could have made it come apart when it wasn't moving. By this time, it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer, leave Ace at the corrals overnight, When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters and continued driving. I also heard some more of those howls, the ones I'd heard earlier in the day. When all 3 of us arrived the next morning, we found the corrals in a total mess. All the grass was turned up inside the corrals where the cattle had been milling. The fence was broken in several places. The cattle that were penned up the night before were nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on horseback, trying to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but they only managed to find around 20 head. As I was without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later in the afternoon. The next day, all 3 of us rode. We searched exclusively for Ace. During this time, I covered a lot of country that I would have otherwise missed, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one of the canyons were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 3 foot deep. These holes had to have been dug by people, as there would be no animal that would have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were the carcasses of 4 cows, all piled on top of each other in an area that they typically would not have accessed. At first, I thought that this was the act of poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch. But there would have been no way to get to this location with a pickup or a 4-wheeler, for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense everything made. We searched for 3 days before we came across something. My brother radioed me. We had no cell service. He told me that he thought they found Ace. My nephew and I rode to his location, and sure enough, at the bottom of a sinkhole, which are pretty common in our area, was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of a canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet tall, the sinkhole being another 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon walls. When I finally approached the sinkhole, I found Ace to be heavily mutilated. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes, nostrils, hooves. The back of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail had been removed. The cows surrounding also had similar mutilations. As was the case with the howls, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for just 1 cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading into or out of the sinkhole or canyon. The sheriff and veterinarian were both notified and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to spook and break out of the corrals. Whatever it was, spooked them so bad that they ran all the way to the mint place, to the bottom of the sinkhole, and that's where they perished. When I mentioned the wolf that I'd seen, detectives were dismissive, just as I had been when the hunters told me of the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected, and the case was closed. Though there are many strange things that have happened since then, there were none quite as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continued to go missing, and now we only ride to the place in pairs. My brother and I are considering terminating the lease, as for the moment, the current cattle losses are unsustainable. I've always been a big YouTube watcher, and I found that many stories on the site came from Reddit, so I decided to share mine.